Welcome to my presentation on exhumations as producing forensic truths about Francoist violence. So just to give you a little bit of a rundown, I'm going to talk about the exhumation of mass graves and how this produces evidence of violence and how this is utilised by different groups. To give you some perspective on the research context, I worked with Armeache in Ponferrada, León, and that was the Association for the Recovery of Historic Memory, and also Arandari, which is a scientific group working out of San Sebastián in the Basque Country. Primarily the exhumation searches and reburials that I undertook and worked on were in Castilla y León, Andalucía, Castilla-La Mancha, Asturias, Galicia, and Madrid. And this was between 2012 and 2016, where I spent 23 months in the field. To give you a very basic overview of the historical context in which I'm operating, the graves that I uncovered were from the Spanish Civil War and the dictatorship, so primarily from 1936 through to 1950. And then what we see in 1975 is with the death of Franco, King Juan Carlos decides to transition the country into democracy. And this is a negotiated silencing. And it's seen to be peaceful and avoiding violence, but there are cases of violence. So I've got a couple here with the Zamarga attack by police on a union meeting in Madrid, in the Basque Country, and also the Madrid Atocha massacre of labour rights lawyers. This is all taking place while the transition is occurring. So the transition goes from 1975 to 1981. And part of that negotiated transition is the amnesty law of 1977, which continues to operate. And it basically puts a full stop that you cannot look at these crimes from the past. And so you can see the cartoons by Nieco symbolizing that, we haven't addressed these crimes from the past. So when we're talking about forensic investigations, typically they're associated with legal investigations, but in the case of Spain, this isn't happening. So in Spain, the statute of limitations on murder has passed, and also because of the amnesty law, you can't look at these crimes. So this basically makes it impossible for this to be a forensic investigation in the typical medico-legal sense. In post-conflict societies, competing narratives or truth claims are often difficult to prove. And with respect to political crimes committed during the Spanish Civil War and the Franco regime, society continues to be divided over competing claims. So your nationalist supporters claim that both sides committed atrocities, and thereby this delegitimizes the demands by Republicans that Francoist atrocities need to be dealt with. From this perspective, all the crimes are in the distant past and they're best left forgotten. And the demands by Republican survivors are seen to be rancorous and motivated by revenge. So here we have a quote from Kleinenberg, and he says, "It's difficult to verify the competing truth claims of antagonists in social conflicts, particularly in a moment of intellectual history when political leaders are as likely as postmodern professors to claim that truths are multiple, perspectival, and partial, and when public relations and information management teams are standard features of every political organisation. But there is one way familiar to anyone who follows cases of political violence, in which adjudicators can establish definitive and reliable evidence, get to the dead bodies, the corpses whose materiality cannot be denied. So here, this idea that, the dead bodies provide this evidence that substantiates these claims. The materiality of remains has been the motive behind the diffusion of images from mass graves, the broken bones through social media and other media sources. Similarly, Rosenblatt says that, the voice of forensic science offers this truth regarding the crimes in contrast with the loop-sided falsity that attempts to mask the reality of violence. So when I'm talking about the exhumations that are taking place in Spain, there's been three phases. The first was during the Civil War and dictatorship. And so these were primarily done by the Franco regime to legitimate their claim and, put forward a narrative around the martyrs for God in Spain, and pay homage to these individuals who were part of that sacrifice. We have a second phase during the transition, so that's between 1975 and 1981, where local family members who know where the graves are go to those graves, unearth them, collect all the remains, and there's fantastical images of, women with aprons holding piles of bones, and they take them to the local cemetery and they're buried together. Now, the phase that I was involved with is the modern scientific archaeological exhumations, and they've taken place since 2000 with the aid of archaeologists, forensic osteologists, and other professionals. And typically, this allows for the individualization, and what we're starting to see is individual graves and people not being communally buried anymore in Spain. So the process of exhumation is a pedagogical ritual. It's designed to revise the past through the materiality of these remains as the dead are reinserted into living memory. The ritual moments that make up the exhumation are important for both the activists, the families, the communities, as a symbolism of the remains is that they appear to constitute a recoding of the past. So the search and the excavation of victims from clandestine graves can have its own individual rhythm, and it can vary in some instances. So there are cases where we will first do the search, and then later on, once we've located the remains, we'll contact the family and arrange for the excavation to take place. And this is particularly when you have elderly relatives who can be quite agitated, because searches can sometimes take 5, 9, 10 days. So there are others where we have to go and do a secondary excavation because military documents have incorrect coordinates for the remains. And so we've identified the remains and found that they're not that relative, and we have to go back and unearth the other remains that are close by. So, and then the last type is the more common one, where we just have the search and the exhumation takes place in the gradual process. Now, the pedagogical approach that's taken by Artemiache seeks to ensure that the exhumations are public events to permit local communities to witness the materialization of the past through the recovery of personal memories and the human remains. So as Marco, and who's the Artemiache vice president, and Renee, the archaeologist, they've both repeatedly explained to me that exhumations need to always be public. So we can see the pedagogical activities that are undertaken by them include like the distribution of photographs and videos, talks at the grave, and other events, and also interviews with media, documentary filmmakers, etc. And these activities establish this grassroots democratization of memory to build support for the exhumations by reincorporating the disappeared into a collective memory. So even in cases where the exhumation is not very significant at a regional or national level, there is a local impact. And they create this sort of dramatic space in which historical events are reenacted. By bringing to the social surface the buried memories of locals. The exhumation opens a space for the democratization of memory that produces a script about the past out of a public interaction at the gravesite. So ARMA constructs a stage to gradually democratize the past grave by grave and awaken the memories that are connected to the events of the disappearance. This stems from long-term aims relating to victims' rights as a push for reparations and to pressure the state to take over the enormous task of searching for the dead, so before the remaining generation of survivors pass away. For survivors, the importance of the public witnessing stems from a need to have the past and their suffering acknowledged at that local community level. And the benefit of allowing exhumations to be open public events permits a type of social reconciliation of the past by the community. So ARMA believes that exhumations need to remain open to the public. And there have been some autonomous regions where this has not always been possible. But here Renee says, well, the exhumation needs to serve this purpose. It is important that the mass grave is open to everyone from the town to attend to see the reality of this scientific work. And he clearly wants to identify and distinguish between political work and scientific work. Here is the evidence, we can prove it, we're making a claim. So what we see is that it involves making a claim about past violence. So as the remains are slowly uncovered, more and more people will start to attend the exhumation site, and this appearance of remains bring with them a local curiosity about what has been discovered. It's at this moment that the storytelling by survivors anchors the present into the past, and the moments of recollection serve to recode the remains that are being uncovered as survivors in the community discuss what happened to that victim. So here Alex is explaining that exhumations serve to reveal the continuation of the state political repression against the surviving victims and families of the disappeared. In a sense, the disappearance is an ongoing crime, and the act of exhumation makes a claim that emphasizes the existence of the dead and the failure of the centralized state to resolve it. And this highlights Armiace's strategy, which is in recovering the missing, they teach history and make an accusation or a claim about the past. And it highlights the limits of participation. This, combined with historical accounts, serve to corroborate both the past and the evidence that are uncovered. During the exhumation, the relatives will often provide an account of what they know or what they've been told regarding what happened to their loved one. So the bodily recovery of victims and public testimonies that are recounted at the gravesite help to recover that personal biography of the deceased and incorporate them into the local history. So here a key example is Prefecto de Dios in Charrero Avila. And here Prefecto's brother, Camilo, and a local man are recounting what happened to Prefecto. And, you know, there was a man that was actually involved with the autopsy, which was quite interesting to have present. But what they were talking about was how their memory of what took place was distinct from the military trial. So the story as it goes is Prefecto's mother and brother and a colleague were trying to escape through Avila to get out of the country because they were being targeted by Francoist regime. And someone at the local bar saw them running and notified the civil guard. The two men got to run away, but the mother got stuck behind, and her son, Prefecto, came back to try and rescue her and was shot dead while he lay in her arms following a shootout. Now, what happens is after this takes place, the police have obviously killed Prefecto, and a military trial is done in absentia to basically say that, you know, he's committed these crimes. And this is really common at that period. And so what we can see is that in telling the story about what happened, you actually are making a claim about the crime that's taken place here. You know, he's in his mother's arms when the police shoot him in the head. They could have easily have taken him to jail. He was already wounded in the leg. So what happens is when we're at the gravesite, there is this constant analysis, right? Any evidence that is collected. Here you can see some remains that have had an autopsy, really poorly done autopsy, but there's been an autopsy conducted on the skull, and you can see the incision by the saw. And what we do is we collect the evidence and we sort of demarcate it on various forms, saying, you know, we found this button, we found this bullet fragment, we found X, Y, Z. And in recording the evidence, the whole point is that the exhumation is seen to be this crime scene. So what Armiace always does is when they model their exhumations on the international protocols that are predicated on the capacity to unearth a forensic truth, right? And so the exhumation of clandestine graves originally adopted a medico-legal investigation after atrocity countries such as Argentina, Chile, and Guatemala, and the Spanish exhumation movement has modeled itself following this example. And they've commonly worked with the Argentinian forensic teams, and I've even worked with the Argentinian forensic teams a couple of times in Spain. And we can see that they are well incorporated within them. But the whole point of contacting the police and saying that, you know, we found remains with signs of violence is that they are trying to sort of point to the fact that this is a crime scene that the state is not dealing with. And so here we've got a quote from Rene, and he says, "We are often the only people present at the scene of the crime. We always call the nearest police station to notify what we have located, you know, remains with signs of violence." And what will typically happen is the police will come, they'll make note of the fact that there's these remains that have been uncovered, and then they'll turn around and they'll say, well, there's an amnesty law and we can't actually address this, so the investigation is not going to go any further, and the association will take over that crime scene. But what this is also is it's recording every time a police officer denies responsibility for investigating the crimes of the past. And so they're recording each and every event that takes place. Now, the other thing that's really important about exhumations, because they're public and they produce this counter narrative, there's always the sort of, there's like a mobile tutorial where the forensic archaeologist will explain what we found in the grave. And here Renee says, we always invite locals to attend the exhumation. If members of the team observe someone standing at a distance, we approach them. They want to inform, they want people to know about what has happened in Spain. And it's part of their policy to disseminate this work that they're doing. I'm going to stop there because I've run out of time, but thank you so much for listening to this.